High School in 1946, which is almost at the time of the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
However, the last 15 years I've spent a lot of my time studying history, Civil War, particularly as it pertained to Plymouth, the area, and the people from Plymouth. I think it's an area that has been ignored. There was an awful lot going on here, and it's just, I think sometimes too that the history of that period is being overlooked. I think sometimes we spend too much time on pilgrims and too little time on their descendants and what happened to them. And the Civil War in this country was as great a cataclysm as World War II was in this country, and I was living here as a teenager in World War II. In fact, basically the situation politically in the country before the Civil War was almost exactly the same as it was before World War II. Before the Civil War, people were arguing back and forth about slavery. Should we let the South go? Some people said, let them go. Who needs them? Get rid of them. We don't want to fight. We don't want those people. Others say, well, you can't let them do that. They're going to destroy the country. And others would say, well, slavery's all right down there as long as we don't have to mess with it. And others would say, we don't want those blacks up here either. They'll take the jobs. And in the two newspapers that were published in Plymouth at that time, the Old Colony and one called the Plymouth Rock News, they were on completely opposite sides of the fence. And they argued back and forth over this. People argued in the street over this. Families just separated over this political question. But when the news came that the South had fired on the Union flag at Fort Sumter, the country came together just like that. The Union came together. The people who were trying to set up companies and enlist people were overwhelmed with people who wanted to go to war. The town itself mobilized overnight. The militias were called out, and the company in Plymouth was known as the Standish Guards. And you know, the funny thing is, I'll get back to them, but the funny thing is, before World War II, we had the same discussions going on, only it was different. You know, we're going to be isolationists. We're not going to miss in Europe's problems. After all, George Washington said, avoid all foreign entanglements. But when Pearl Harbor came, the country came together, bang, like that. And again, the same thing happened. The recruiting officers were overwhelmed with people who wanted to go to war. But to get back to Plymouth before the Civil War, once that came through, the word came down from Boston, the 3rd Regiment of Mass Volunteer Militia was mobilized. Okay, Standish Guards was Company C of that regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Carroll Doughton of Plymouth. The night it came in, the word came in at 3:30 in the morning that they had been mobilized. Of course, the news had come the day before about Sumter being fired on. The whole town was awake, in the streets. Now, it was raining. It was a cold northeast rainstorm that we get in April around here. The streets were muddy, and just about the entire town was out there at 3:30 in the morning. And I mean, the place was just seething with people. The militiamen were called. They met at the Armory, which, as near as I can find out now, was down in the parking lot where the IGA store is, down in back there. In fact, I've got a picture somewhere that shows the two buildings before Main Street Extension was built, and you can see between them, and you can see Armory on the building down there. Anyway, the ones that were ready to go, 19 of them showed up at the Armory, in uniform and equipped as much as they had, and they were ready to go. The entire town saw them off at the station. They marched up Main Street and Court Street. They were led by the Robbins Brass Band, and there were young women with throwing flowers, and the entire town was behind them. They were taken to the Standish House, or the Samoset House rather, which is on the corner of Samoset and Court, and were provided a libation, a great breakfast. They were then marched down to the station, which is where the bank is now, and speeches were spoken, and tears were shed, and cheers were cheered, and they were sent off to war. And when they marched to the station, something I came across, they had flowers in the muzzles of their muskets. There's nothing new under the sun, really. And as they went off to war to Boston that morning, they were waving out the windows of the railroad cars and said, "We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Chivalry can't fight," which was a dirty word for the Southerners. Of course, down south, the Southerners were saying those mud hens back up north, they can't fight. Strange thing was, some of them didn't come back till about 4 years to the day when the war was over. And a lot of them didn't come back at all, because most of them, they had enlisted for 3 months. Most of them, when they came back in July, before the end of the year, re-enlisted for 3 years and longer. One that seemed particularly poignant to me was a young man named Frederick Holmes, who was recording secretary for the Standish Guards. He was in the 3 months, he came back. Then he and Charles Doughton re-enlisted in the 38th Regiment of the Mass Volunteer Infantry in August of 1862. Frederick Holmes was killed in July of 1863 at Port Hudson, Louisiana, by friendly fire. The cannon shell fell short. He didn't have to go back, but he did. I ran across cases of people from here and from other places who would re-enlist 3 and 4 times. After they'd been wounded, sent home, discharged as disabled, they'd get better, they'd re-enlist and go back. I don't know of another war our country has fought in where that was even permitted, much less thought of. If you were wounded during World War II or Vietnam or Korea or any of the others, to the point where you were discharged, you counted yourself lucky to be alive and happy to be home. And to hell with going back. These guys went back over and over. And I think that was what started me on the Civil War, is trying to find out what kind of, I don't know what you call it, faith or strength or belief or loyalty or what you call it, but trying to find out what this quality was. And trying to find out why in some ways we seem to have lost it. It was there. These men, they didn't want to die, any of them, on either side, but they believed so strongly that they willingly went to do this. Trying to find this quality in these men. And these were not, a lot of them were not educated men. They were workmen, they were tradesmen, they were plumbers and cobblers and carpenters and so on. And then on the other hand, they were from Harvard, they were from Yale, they were from everywhere you could think of. They had one guiding force, every one of them had, was this loyalty, this desire. I don't really know the word to use. I still haven't found it. Probably never will, but the search is fascinating. When the day after the Standish Guards left, William T. Davis, who was president of the, I can't remember what bank it was, Plymouth Savings Bank or something like this. Anyway, he got together some of the other leading lights in town, and the first thing he did is he sent a message to Governor John A. Andrew of Massachusetts and offered him $20,000 of the bank's money at no interest to help prosecute the war. In the state of Massachusetts, within 3 days, the banks contributed $3 million to the state treasury to prosecute the war, to outfit soldiers, to do anything is needed. And this was with no strings attached and at no interest. You imagine that happening today? I can't. And this was $3 million in 1861 dollars, which is a lot of money. They then turned around and they had a big meeting in Plymouth the next week. They called everybody together, or at least the leading lights, at Davis Hall, and they had a big meeting as to what they were going to do for the soldiers and their families. This town voted to actually, what's the word I want to use? Anyway, they voted to pay each soldier's family a set amount of money a month to help support wife and children while he was away fighting. Plymouth was the first town in Massachusetts to do this with town money. Massachusetts was the first state in the Union to do this with town money, with state money. We had a lot of firsts. They called in those days, the federal government did not uniform the soldiers. The individual towns had to do their own militia companies. So they called from the pulpits, and that's the following Sunday after the men had left. They called from the pulpits all the ladies together again at Davis Hall to sit down and sew underclothes, shirts, uniforms, knit socks, anything they needed. Well, they started out the next Monday, and it soon became very apparent that they were not going to have enough cloth. So they passed a paper around to everybody to sign to subscribe money to buy more cloth. Well, there were 3 or 4 women who, for one reason or another, could not or did not sign. From that day on, they were classed as traitors in the town. The stores refused to sell to them. Nobody would talk to them. And that extended to their families. Some of them had to move away because they really put them in, there's a term from World War II called being put in Coventry, which means exactly the same thing, and that's exactly what they did. They were treated as though they were non-persons. They did not exist. And a couple of families moved away. They couldn't stand it. It gives you an idea just how fierce and how deep the feeling went. I don't remember anybody doing that in town in World War II. There were people that you figure were slackers or draft dodgers, but nobody isolated them like that. But boy, they did then. The feeling went deep. There was an article in the Old Colony. When the company from East Bridgewater and Plimpton went down to Fortress Monroe to join what was going to be the 29th Regiment. They found out that by that time the government was not accepting anyone unless they enlisted for 3 years. Well, they had enlisted for 3 months to go with another regiment of their friends. They found out that if they were going, they had to enlist for 3 years. After they got down there, that's what they found out. They said, no way. And they came home. They turned around later on and did go for 3 years. But they came home. Now, the Old Colony published this story. And right underneath it, they published this tremendous story about the Plymouth Rock Guards, which was Sam Doughton's company, had enlisted for 3 years. The manly men of Plymouth will enlist for 3 years. These wusses, these wimps, you know. And the way the stories are placed in the paper, you can't get away from the idea. Here's the wimps, but here's Plymouth men. And they did it that way. They did it on purpose. You go back through the newspaper, and there's some strange things in there. There's many of the people who went acted as either free or part-time correspondents. They wrote letters back, and the paper published them. Those letters are a gold mine of information. They tell what they were seeing. They tell how they were living. The 3rd Regiment, when it first went down there, damn near starved to death because the colonel they had, Colonel Wardrop, had the supplies, but he wouldn't let them have them. Because if you give them out, you know, these guys are going to use them up. You can't have that. So he kept them. They almost starved to death. And what happened was William Davis, Dr. LeBaron Russell, and a couple of other people were sent down by Governor Andrew to inspect. And I've got his entire report. And things changed after that. Colonel Wardrop disappeared. Actually, he was court-martialed and discharged. Because these guys were walking around, their clothes were falling off them, half of them didn't have shoes, and they weren't getting the food they should have. Just because this guy had the warehouse full and he liked it full. So they were not, basically they were human beings just like we are now. They had the same failings. Some of them transcended them, some of them did not. But basically most of them were just plain guys. Most of them had never been away from home before. Many of them had never been to Boston, much less to Fortress Monroe and other places they went. When they went to Boston, they bivouacked in the upstairs over the old Colony Railroad station, and they filled Faneuil Hall with some from other towns. They had more fun trying to keep those guys in those places, because most of these guys are 18, 19, 20 years old. Never been to Boston, never been away from home. My God, we're free! They were going out the windows, down the drain pipes, they were going everywhere. They were going crazy trying to keep them in these buildings. And they lost some of them. But they all schemed to wander back in time to go. By the time they were there a couple of days. And then the rest of the men in the company caught up until there were about 60 in the Standish Guards. And they put them out in the harbor on the S.R. Paulding, the ship. There were another 10 they had to wait for, so they waited for them, and then they left. And I ran across one letter one guy wrote, and he wrote back telling to the paper, and I guess to his wife, what it was like. And I can see this picture so clear because he was telling about standing on the deck, leaning on a rail, smoking a pipe, and watching Cape Cod disappear in the distance. Not knowing if he was coming back or when or anything. That had to be, even though he didn't say so, a lonely moment. Just watch everything he knew just sort of vanish back in the fog. It was gone. He also wrote an account of the Battle of the Merrimack and the Monitor, which is a good one, but I've got one in a New Hampshire regimental history, which is an incredible one, written by a man who stood on the bank, watched it, and could write. It's incredible. Incredible account. But anyway, they went down to Fortress Monroe, and they got down there on the Paulding, and they took them off that ship, and they put them on the Pawnee, the USS Pawnee, and they sent them to Norfolk, Virginia, to destroy the Navy Yard there. Now you got a picture. This is at night. These guys are, I mean, this is high drama. This is night. They're down on the deck and it's dark. And the Pawnee was not a steam frigate. She was a sailing ship, so she was going very quietly. As they come into the harbor at Norfolk, there are other ships anchored there, but there are no lights anywhere. All you can see these black hulks here and there. And there was another U.S. warship there. And they saw the ship ghosting in the dark. So they quietly stood to their guns, had all their cannon loaded. And then somebody hailed this mysterious stranger, and they found out it was a Union ship just before they were going to pour a broadside into her. About 5 minutes. If they hadn't hailed back with the right words, they'd have blown that ship out of the water, and the Standish Guards would have ceased to exist right then and there. Anyway, they got through. They started burning and destroying the Navy Yard. It was the largest Navy Yard on the East Coast at that time. And you've got to picture this, because these guys were basically untrained. They were a mob. And some of them were running out and dumping arms and so forth in the bay. Others were setting buildings on fire. Others were trying to blow up wharves, but it was explosives they didn't even know how to use. But the thing that I got the biggest kick out of was one of the squads out of the Standish Guards was sent to set the Merrimack, which is a wooden frigate, on fire, which they did. What they didn't know was there was another squad down that also had been detailed to open the Seacocks on the Merrimack. So it sank before it could burn. But it came back to haunt the Union as the CSS Virginia. or the Merrimack, or the Monitor and the Merrimack. But it gives you an idea of how really disorganized these guys were. A mob. And they did. They totally destroyed the Navy Yard. And of course they were afraid they were going to be attacked because they'd been told there was a regiment of Confederates in the area. There wasn't. But every time a dog would bark, everybody would freeze in the sweat. Oh boy. Anyway, they get back to Fortress Monroe, and then the next morning, that's when they were sworn in as federal troops. So when they went to Norfolk, they were state militia. They were illegal as hell. They were a mob. They had no legal right to be there. But it was war. So they got their baptism of fire. That was basically all the Standish Guards really got involved in. They were at Fortress Monroe until the end of July. They did not get involved in First Bull Run. They were involved in Fortress Monroe primarily to mount guns, to unload supplies. They did get into a couple of little skirmishes. One of their sentries damn near shot the commanding general one night because he didn't give him the right password. He took a shot at him, but he missed. The general put him on bread and water for a week because he missed. The guy said he never missed again. But they were involved basically in preparatory work. They came home the end of July to a riotous welcome. The Robbins Brass Band met them again, and by this time Plymouth had organized a home guard unit to man two forts that had been built on Saquesh and on the Gurnet. So they marched to meet them. Again, the entire town, the young girls, what would amount to the Vestal Virgins, were there, all dressed up with flowers and everything else. A libation at the Samoset House, and speeches. And this is when the medal was presented to Charles Doughton. The medal was 2 inches in diameter, made of gold, with a silver border. And it was heavily embossed on both sides, and had a ribbon. And the commander of the Standish Guards was supposed to wear this on ceremonial occasions as a memory of their service. Well, the Standish Guards was disbanded in 1877, and most of their material disappeared, and the medal among it. And I have no idea. I would love to find that medal because I think that medal belongs here in Plymouth. I think it belongs in the library or in the museum somewhere because it's an integral part of the history of this town and its people.
Who was it that presented that?
Robert T. Hall presented it and made the speech. He was a leading light in those days. I think it should be here. If anybody ever knows anything about it, I would love to hear about it as to where it is, if it even exists anymore. It would be, of course, valuable as gold, but I would think a great deal more valuable as a relic of those times, as a memory of those men. The Standish Guards did suffer one casualty. 4 days after they came home, young Henry Pierce of Plimpton died of typhoid fever. And they had a full military funeral, the whole works. And I've got descriptions of it out of the paper. Most of them re-enlisted in one outfit or another. Several of them were killed. Many of them were wounded. And some didn't go back at all. Charles Doughton re-enlisted in the 38th Regiment, and he was discharged in New Orleans for disability.
Good time to show that material.
Yeah, for disability, and he was discharged because they said he had consumption and he only had a few months to live. Now this was in 1863. Charles Doughton lived till 1918. Somebody was wrong. These we came across at a flea market. This is, you might like to see these. This is his receipt for the money he was due to come home from New Orleans. The thing is that he didn't get his money till 1884, 21 years later. But there it is, signed by him. This is Charles Doten's commission. Let's see. The Justice of the Peace. This is dated 1865. This is the original paper signed by Governor John Andrew. And these are not copies. These are the thing. This one, also Justice of the Peace, and this is dated 1855 and signed by the then Governor of Massachusetts. This one is his appointment to the Board of Harbor and Land Commissioners. And this is dated 1900 and, let's see, 2. And again, signed by the then governor with the state seal. I found these at a flea market. And the old lady had a whole bunch of documents and letters and everything. It's all piled in a box. And I went looking through and this is what I found. These are the originals. How they got to a flea market, I'll never know. And someday, if I could be sure that they'll be well taken care of, I'll give them to the town. But until I'm sure of that, they stay here. And the reason I feel that way is I have a picture upstairs. It's a prang print of Andersonville. It and the frame it's in hung in the GAR hall here in Plymouth. When the last Grand Army of the Republic member died, the post was obviously dismantled. I bought the picture in Virginia. Now how it got there, I'll never know. But all the paraphernalia out of that GAR post is gone. Nobody cared. Until I'm sure that somebody cares, some of the things I have are not going anywhere. Because they mean too much. These are people's lives. These are not just pieces of paper. Charles Doten came home. He published the Old Colony Memorial. He was director of Pilgrim Hall for many years. He was a power in the town. He did a lot for the town. And to just kiss him off like he didn't exist, I don't think it should be done. Or any of them that went and served in any war. But this one in particular. There's so many stories. There's Samuel Wright, of course. Samuel Cole Wright was a young man from Plimpton. He enlisted in Sam Doten's company, the 29th Mass, and he went off to war. As it happens, I have his military records. I also have a picture of him as a young man. And he was about 6 feet tall and very handsome. Good-looking guy. And as the story goes, when he found out that they were enlisting a company, he was plowing a field on his father's farm, which incidentally, if you go out Route 106 and see Sam Wright Estates, where they're building houses, that was Sam Wright's farm. And as the story goes, he tied the horses to a tree and walked to Plymouth and enlisted. And never went home and told his father. Just left the horses there. I imagine his father found them sooner or later. Anyway, he had the most incredible career of any soldier I've come across. Because, and you have to keep in mind that this is a time when medicine, compared to what we have now, was caveman style. You could die from a cut on the finger because they had nothing to fight sepsis or infection. Anyway, in his first battle, he was wounded in the head with a shell fragment and left on the battlefield to die. Thing is, he didn't die. Next time out, he got shot in the arm, which was a minor inconvenience. His third major battle was at Antietam. And at the Battle of the Sunken Road, the Union troops had charged time after time, trying to break through this line of Confederates. Finally, they were called what they called the Forlorn Hope. They asked for volunteers to charge. 75 men volunteered. He was one of them. They stood up and they charged into mass fire. Now, I've been to Antietam, and during that charge, they were being fired on by cannon from both sides and musketry from the front. They made the charge, and they broke through the fence. Of the 75 men who started, only 6 survived it. He was one, but he was shot through both thighs with a mini ball, which is an ounce and a half of lead. He was sent home to recuperate, and he went back. He went back in time to join the regiment before Vicksburg, where he promptly contracted typhoid. They sent him to the hospital in New Orleans, and he was so bad off, the doctors assumed he was going to die, so they told his mother he was dead and sent his effects home. He got better. Good enough to rejoin his regiment with Sherman going across the South. And in one of those little adventures, a cannon fell in the creek, and he and other men were trying to get it out, and it fell again, and fell on him and broke his leg. Well, he couldn't obviously march, so they left him behind with 2 or 3 other wounded men in a cave. Then they had to retreat. But the upshot was that he and the other wounded men in the cave wound up 14 miles behind enemy lines. No food, no water, no nothing. Well, he stood there 3 or 4 days and decided he wasn't going to die there. So he and a young captain from New York who'd been shot in the back started to go to Union lines, crawling. Well, the young captain died after 4 miles, but Sam Wright made the 13 miles, broken leg and all. And he hung around down there till it healed, and they went through Resaca, Georgia, where he re-upped for another whatever long it was going to take to do the war. And somehow or other, he got himself run over with a wagon load of oats, and which broke both ankles and his pelvis. Well, he came home again, and he recuperated some more. And he went back and joined a unit which had now been sent to the Army of the Potomac, and he was with them at Cold Harbor, where he was again shot in the arm. Minor, you know. Finally, he wound up at the Battle of the Crater in Petersburg. And during the Battle of the Crater, he was shot in the right eye with an 1.5 ounce slug and left for dead. Somehow or other, he got back to an aid station and then back to a hospital in Washington, where they proceeded to extract the bullet, only they took it out the way it went in. The bullet had penetrated to the back of his skull. They had no x-ray in those days. So the only way you could find it is to follow the path in. So they went in and they got it and they pulled it back out. Obviously he lost the eye, but he did recover, and he came home, and for 3 or 4 years he was unemployable. He got married and fathered a daughter, and then he went to work at the Customs House in Boston and stayed there off and on until he retired. He became collector of customs, and he died in Plimpton at his summer home on the farm in 1906 of a heart attack. But he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Antietam that day. Now, he's buried here in Plymouth. He has a bronze plaque denoting him as a Medal of Honor winner. But this was a career in a time, as I said, when medicine was in its infancy. There was no idea of sterilization. There was no idea of antisepsis, anything. And yet he survived. It was incredible. But he's here, and he's been forgotten in our addiction to pilgrims, fascination with pilgrims. Here's the Medal of Honor winner, the only one I know of buried in Plymouth. And until we found him 5 years ago and got him his plaque, nobody even knew he was here or cared. I don't think that's right. He believed. After all the pain and torture and terror he went through, he believed. The man should be remembered for that. As should all the others up there on Burial Hill. You go up there are small white headstones. Those are government headstones. Every one will list a man's name and his unit in the Civil War. Every one of those men should be remembered because they believed. Some of them came home to find nothing. Others came home, today we call it stress syndrome from Vietnam. Some of those guys had it too. Some of them just never fit in again. Some did. Some had no problem at all. It's been that way with every war. Some of them didn't come home. They went west. They just vanished into the country somewhere. Some of them, their families never heard from them again. They didn't know whether they were alive or dead. They just never heard from them again. They went west. You go out to Colorado in the western towns, you go up in the old western towns in the mountain and go to the graveyards. The graveyards are full of Civil War veterans from every state in the Union. North, South, there were so many of them that just didn't have anything to go back to or nothing they could fit into any longer, and they went out there. And this is something we don't realize, that such an upheaval in this country. Over 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War because everybody was an American on both sides. It didn't matter. They were Americans. It was in a population of 30 million. If you took that and in proportion to today's population of 250 million, it's about 7.5 times, you'd have maybe 5 million men dead. That would take an entire generation. Right out of the heart of the country, which is what the Civil War did. Of our country right then. And the thing is, the North did not want the blacks up here. They were afraid they'd take jobs. And they considered them pretty much the way Southerners did, as damn niggers and less than human, subhuman, fit only for drudge work. They didn't want them here. They treated them, the Union soldiers treated the blacks, the slaves, almost as badly, in some cases worse, than the Southerners did. I have one letter from a young man who was stationed with the 44th Regiment in New Bern, North Carolina. And at that time they were giving him quinine because malaria was endemic anywhere where it was warm and wet. So they were giving him quinine. But they made up a drink. They gave it to their, what they call contraband, the Negroes that had come into the Union troops, in the Union lines. They made up a drink with quinine, kerosene, Tabasco sauce, hot red peppers, and what the hell, it was something, gunpowder. And they mixed this all up together and fed this to the blacks. And then stood around and laughed. Well, this damn near was to burn the gullets out. Well, they headed for the river trying to get water, and of course water in that mixture only makes it worse. They thought this was a great joke. These were the troops that came to liberate them. In Georgia, after the war was over and the occupation troops were there, there was a woman, I've got her book here, and she recalls some of her blacks had come back to work on the place. It was the only home they knew. They had no money, they had no trade. This was the only place they knew in the world. They came back to work, and she paid them. But there was a couple of them that would be, at that time, would have been called uppity niggers. So she called the local occupying unit, whoever it was. He sent out half a dozen soldiers, and they tied these guys up against the barn and whipped the living hell out of them. These are the men that came to liberate them. This was after the war was over. There was no more slavery. But they did it. And the only point I'm making is that we were not saints. The Confederates were not monsters. They were only people on both sides with all the same failings. It's the only war we've ever been in where we spoke the same language as our enemy. It's the only war we've ever been in where we all went to the same churches. We believed in the same religions. Where a Confederate chaplain would preach to Union troops, and they'd understand him. They believed the same way. It's the only war I've ever heard of where a minister can get up in a pulpit and using the same passages out of the Bible prove that slavery is God's will and that slavery is an abomination of the devil, using the same words. And that was done. It gives you an idea of what was involved here. In World War II or the other wars, we've always known clearly who our enemy was. But in this war, I think in some ways our enemy was us. And there were so many instances of families being split, a brother shooting brother, father shooting son. We still have the dichotomy today. We still haven't gotten over this terrible thing. The wounds are still here and the wounds are still open. Even now, when they fly the Confederate flag down south and people get all upset, I don't see anything wrong with them flying that. Those men are as much heroes as the men who fought under the Union flag because they believed as strongly, they gave as much. Surely they deserve as much pride. And I don't think it's being flown to keep the blacks down or anything else. I think it's being flown because they have to salvage something. They were beaten, there was no question about that. But they have to salvage pride, and that's pride. You've got to at least have pride in having fought a good fight, even though you lost. And I think that's what they're doing. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think the people who are creating all the problem and the uproar about it are wrong. I really do. The South had black soldiers who fought for the South. We had black soldiers who fought for the North, and they were brave, and they fought, and they died. They have a right to fly those flags, too. It's a subject that I guess I can talk about for hours and hours and hours. And try not to say the same things over and over again, but there are some points that I think we should hear over and over again. That we do have, and we are a people who will and can, when the time calls for it, place it, everything we own, right up front, including our lives, and do it willingly. I think that makes us strong. I really do. And we did it then, we've done it since, and I'm sure if the occasion ever arose again, we'd do it again. But I think we should look back on these times so that we can see what we are. Because we are what those people made us. We are their influence. We are the sum total at this point in time of all those people who have gone before. And I think we ought to look back and take a peek at just how good we've been and how good we can be. I run out of gas.
That's good, George. Real good.